Hey everyone, hope you're well. I haven't got a guitar in my hands. I don't know what to do with myself. My name is Kelly Dean Allen, and today we're going to have a look at five classic and iconic guitars, coupled with five of the most famous guitar solos that have ever been played on them. And I'm going to do my damn best to recreate each and every one of them, both note for note and tone matched, using the wonderful Bias FX 2 guitar software suite. Now, all of these gorgeous high-end guitars that we'll be having a look at today are from the personal collection of my coworker and good friend, Sean Neal. Hey, Sean. Sean often loans me guitars from his outstanding collection, and he broached this topic to me a number of weeks ago about profiling and showcasing five or six of them in one video on my channel. I thought it was a brilliant idea, so here we are. Now, these are just a few of Sean's guitars. He also has another American Stratocaster, different than the one we'll be featuring here in this video a little bit later on. He also has a Gibson ES339, another American-made Telecaster other than this one, any number of Taylor and Martin acoustic guitars. This all discounting the numerous amps and pedals that he also has. It's rather insane, really, but I'm quite jealous. A truly outstanding and one would imagine a rather pricey collection. This is round about $20,000 worth of guitars just sitting here beside me. And like I said, today we're going to have a look at each of these guitars, chat about it a little bit before giving each a playthrough on one of its most famous guitar solos. Starting with the big one, this beauty right here, the Gibson Les Paul. Now, the Gibson Les Paul. Now, discounting the Fender Stratocaster, which we'll get to soon enough, no other guitar in the long and storied history of rock and roll music has made quite the impact over its 70-year musical journey than the Gibson Les Paul. It has molded and shaped rock and roll in the hands of some of the greatest guitar players in history, ever since it was first released way, way back in 1952. Some of the biggest axe-wielding guitar legends, from Jimmy Page and Peter Frampton to Duane Allman, Randy Rhoads, Zakk Wylde, and Slash, of course, have opted to make this single-cut beast of a guitar their number one guitar of choice. As a result, have firmly embedded the Gibson Les Paul into its esteemed place in music history. This particular Les Paul is a 2007 Gibson Les Paul Standard Plus, in this absolutely gorgeous nitro desert burst finish. The plus appendage denotes the beautiful flamed maple top on the face of this guitar, which, as you can see, is just stunning. It has two Burstbucker Pro pickups, a 60s neck profile, one-piece chambered mahogany body for much-needed Les Paul weight relief. This guitar weighs just a tad over 7 pounds, very light as compared to the backbreakers of the earlier years of the Les Paul. Now, it goes without saying that guitars in the 50s, 60s, and 70s didn't get much heavier than the Gibson Les Paul. I found this little infographic online that I thought was quite funny, and I think it kind of speaks for itself. It also speaks for anyone who's ever strapped on one of these behemoths. Very funny. We've also got 22 frets, which I like, rosewood fretboard, which I like, traditional trapezoid inlays, your Kluson Keystone style Gibson tuners, your traditional rhythm lead selector switch up here, your two volumes, your two tone controls, as is custom, and also as is custom, the Gibson Tunematic bridge. And, lovely binding all around as well. Just a gorgeous guitar this is. And today we're going to feature it on Gary Moore's wonderful mid-song solo to Still Got the Blues. Now, aside from Gary's immense talent on the instrument, he was also quite well known as being the second owner of Greenie for a number of years. Greenie being Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac's famed 1959 Les Paul, one of the most valuable classic guitars in the world, and currently in the hands of Metallica's Kirk Hammett, who purportedly paid upwards of $2 million for it. However, it was a different 59 Les Paul that Gary used for the solo to Still Got the Blues. This one. A slightly darker flame top Les Paul that was one of Gary's personal favorites, and one that he continued to play regularly right up until his untimely death in 2011. So then, without further ado, let's put this Les Paul into action and give a playthrough of Gary Moore's classic solo to Still Got the Blues. All right, then, moving on. It's obviously all Gibsons and Fenders here, so let's alternate back and forth throughout the rest of this video and move on now to one of the iconic Fenders next, the famed Fender Stratocaster, the #1 selling guitar of all time, the much imitated, much copied, and much loved Fender Strat. There are few, if any, electric guitars more iconic than the Fender Stratocaster, arriving just a few years after the world's first mass-produced solid-body electric guitar, the original Fender Broadcaster, soon to be Telecaster, in 1950. The then-new Stratocaster quickly became Fender's best-selling instrument and remains as such to this very day. In 2020, Fender sold more Stratocasters than any other year in the company's history. Remarkable. And a majority of them to women, which is kind of nice, I think. Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, David Gilmour, Ritchie Blackmore, Stevie Ray Vaughan. These are not the women, by the way. Jeff Beck, Rory Gallagher, John Mayer, Mark Knopfler, just to name a few. All players who made the iconic Fender Stratocaster their primary guitar of choice throughout their careers. This particular Stratocaster is a 2014 American-made limited edition in traditional burst with just an absolutely gorgeous one-piece rosewood neck, including headstock. The neck and headstock are obviously the highlights and the real showstoppers on this one. However, the whole guitar has a real Fender custom shop look and feel about it, down to its etched Fender headstock logo on its rosewood headstock, to its aged volume and tone controls and selector switch, to its custom shop Fat 50 single coil pickups. Just a stunning classic looking guitar, and I could showcase this guitar with any number of famous and well-known guitar solos. But I thought that, of them all, Jimi Hendrix would be best suited, as he was one of the first rock guitarists to really bring the Stratocaster into the mainstream limelight and use it pretty much exclusively. This is the solo to Hendrix's cover of Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower, played on this beautiful sunburst rosewood neck 2014 American-made Fender Stratocaster. All right, back to Gibson again and another Les Paul, but this time the iconic and famous P90 Soap Bar Gold Top Les Paul. This is where it all began, back in 1952. Gibson's solid body answer to Fender's very popular broadcaster Telecaster, which came out a year previous. At its debut in 1952 and for the 6 years thereafter, the Les Paul Standard was a bit like the introduction of the Ford Model T automobile many years earlier. You could have it in any color you wanted, as long as that color was gold. This guitar is Gibson's 2018 reinvention of that very guitar from the early to mid 50s, including zero weight relief modification, so it weighs just a damn ton. Though a remake of the classic 50s guitar, of course, it does have a few modern customizations in hardware and in electronics. If I'm not mistaken, I think this model in particular is based on the 56 Les Paul model and not anything from earlier that decade. The main difference and giveaway here being that this one has a two-piece bridge rather than the one-piece bridge common on earlier 50 models. It has the tried and true heavy Gibson mahogany body and maple top, with that iconic and classic gold top finish. A slimmer mahogany 60s profile neck rather than the rather thick baseball bat style neck of the original early 50s models. That being one of the bigger modifications on this guitar. Bound rosewood fretboard with your acrylic trapezoid inlays as usual. 22 frets as well, just the way I like it. Hand-wired electronics. The two classic single-coil P90 soap bar pickups, as is tradition on these guitars. 2 volumes, 2 controls, your 3-way toggle selector switch, Grover kidney tuners, and all nickel-plated hardware. The remade classic Les Paul from the 50s. And going back to the 50s, it was bluesman Freddie King and, of course, Les Paul himself who were two of the early legendary guitarists to promote and sing the praises of the Les Paul Gold Top, and both used it quite regularly. Into the 60s, 70s, and beyond, numerous others would fall in love with and utilize the Gold Top in both a live setting and on many of their recordings. Just a few of those names include Tom Scholz of Boston, Duane Allman, of course, Steve Hackett of Genesis, Gary Morrigan, Billy Gibbons, Keith Richards, Joe Bonamassa, amongst many others. A rather interesting little tidbit of information that I dug up that I'd like to share with you. Neil Young. Now, Neil Young's famous Old Black Les Paul that he's used on the vast majority of his electric recordings and live isn't a black guitar. It's actually a painted 53 Gold Top. I thought that was kind of interesting. Regardless, the solo that I've chosen to showcase this beauty is by none of the aforementioned guitarists. It's by a guitarist who is predominantly a Stratocaster player, but chose to use his 55 P90 Gold Top for this particular solo of his. It's easily one of his most famous solos, and as I said, one not played on his trusty Strat, but on one of these lovely guitars. This is the solo to Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2 by David Gilmour on this lovely 2018 P90 Gold Top Les Paul. All right then, back to Fender before we close this out with one more Gibson. Arguably the third most iconic guitar in the history of the electric guitar, we of course have the Fender Telecaster. First introduced in 1951 as the Fender Broadcaster, its name was quickly switched to the Telecaster for copyright infringement reasons. It is generally considered to be the very first mass-produced solid-body electric guitar, and as I mentioned earlier, was such a groundbreaking shift in guitar technology and design that it forced Gibson's hand into creating something to compete with it. That, of course, being the Gibson Les Paul. The Telecaster was a big hit right out of the gate, and like its Fender sibling, the Stratocaster, which would come along a few years later, it stylistically remains exactly the same guitar today as it was over 70 years ago. It's damned hard to improve upon perfection, I suppose. Now, the name of the game with the Fender Telecaster was, and still is, versatility. Equally at home in country music as it was in the blues during the 50s and in the early 60s. As the 60s rolled into the 70s, it found more and more favor with rock and hard rock guitarists. Some who took that telly twang, ran it through some fuzz and distortion pedals, and to create some truly monstrous rock tones. It's also a great jazz guitar, and has even found favor with a few discerning metal guitarists over the years. This particular Fender Telecaster is Sean's pride and joy. It's a 2013 Closet Custom Shop Pro Series. It has a very lightweight ash body in this lovely nitro blonde finish with a few light relic touches here and there, but not overdone, which is kind of nice. Super hot twisted telly single coil pickups, a one-piece C-shaped 60s profile neck, hand-oiled maple neck at that, with a maple fretboard, a somewhat flat fingerboard radius, which is kind of nice because I like to shred, finished off with 22 frets. It's got locking tuners and a low-profile Telecaster bridge with brass saddles. Just a lovely and gorgeous guitar, and it cost a goddamn fortune. I'm always extra careful when I borrow this one. This is certainly at the higher end of high-end tellies. Today, we're going to showcase this gorgeous guitar with arguably the most famous Telecaster solo of them all, the solo to Stairway to Heaven by Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin. As is similar to what I previously mentioned about David Gilmour, Jimmy Page has become almost synonymous with the Gibson Les Paul over the years. But in the early years, he was very much a Telecaster player, and he still used it quite often, even after making the switch to the Les Paul. Many actually think that the solo to Stairway to Heaven was actually played on a Les Paul, but it was definitely the Telly, a 59 Telecaster given to him by Jeff Beck, to be exact. This one. You know this one. So let's put this beauty into action with my take on the solo to Stairway to Heaven. Look at this thing. God damn. All right, then, let's finish up with the last iconic guitar that we'll be discussing today. This beautiful TV yellow Les Paul Special. Released initially in 1955 as a single cutaway guitar, this was basically the budget model of the more expensive Les Paul Standard. Painted in bright, bright yellow as to show up better for players and performers who used it on black and white television at the time, It would thus attain the TV Yellow moniker years later. In 1958, the model received a major change when it was introduced as a double cutaway model, just like this one, instead of the previous single cutaway. This was a rather important design change because in the late 50s, the Gibson Les Paul and its submodels, such as the Les Paul Jr. and the Special, were not selling well. They had fallen out of favor with guitarists, and changes definitely needed to be made to get things back on track for Gibson. So in the early 60s, production was halted on all traditional-looking Les Paul models, and they all received a drastic change in design when they were all sort of mashed together into what we know today as the Gibson SG, the double-cut design being a holdover from the Special, except much pointier. This would be Gibson's flagship guitar for the next 7 years or so and sold very well, while no Les Pauls of any sort were being produced during this period. Actually, to be more accurate, the SG was actually called a Les Paul upon its introduction, but Les Paul the man wanted nothing to do with the guitar as he didn't like it, and made it known that he didn't want his name attached to the guitar. So it was rebranded the Solid Guitar, aka SG. Regardless, as the 60s grew to a close, the Les Paul Standard from the 50s and some of these guitars, the Junior and the Specials, started to find favor amongst amateur and professional guitarists again. So in 1968, all of the original models, including the Junior and Special, were rebooted, and they've remained in production ever since. Though this guitar is by no means cheap, in the early days it was a cheaper, bare-bones, somewhat stripped-down version of the Les Paul Standard. If you were a famed musician, you generally played the top-of-the-line gear of the day, such as the Les Paul or the Stratocaster or the Telecaster. However, there were and still are a number of well-known players who still find favor with the poor man's Les Paul, be it the Junior or the lovely Special that we have here today. John Lennon, Keith Richards, Leslie West of Mountain, Billy Joe Armstrong of Green Day, Ian Hunter, Neil Young, Steve Howe of Yes, again, amongst many others. This particular guitar is a 1997 Gibson Les Paul TV Yellow Special, with its double P90 soap bar pickups in black, mahogany body and neck with a 50s style D-neck profile, so she's fairly chunky. Rosewood fretboard, again 22 frets, Kluson vintage style tuners. Though a solid mahogany body, it's still reasonably light at about 7.5 pounds, as it's a fair bit thinner than the Les Paul Standard. Just a lovely and absolutely gorgeous classic guitar. Today, we're going to feature this beauty with arguably the most famous guitar solo ever put down on a Gibson Yellow Les Paul Special, the solo to Aqualung by Martin Barre of Jethro Tull, a huge fan of the Les Paul Special and a regular user of the guitar during much of his time with Jethro Tull throughout the 70s. Let's play a little Aqualung on a TV Yellow, shall we? Well, that's it. I certainly hope you enjoyed that nearly as much as I enjoyed having Sean's guitar collection in my studio over the past week. Thank you very much, Sean. That was great fun. It's awfully nice knowing that I have all of these great classic guitars at my disposal whenever I may need or want them. You're a good guy, Sean. Take care of yourselves out there and practice hard, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.